The crimson sun blazed over the Pacific as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stared at the vast expanse of ocean from the bridge of his flagship Yamato on June 3, 1942. The architect of Pearl Harbor felt the weight of the Empire's fate, pressing against his shoulders like the humid air that clung to his uniform. In his weathered hands lay the most audacious naval operation ever conceived, Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll that would supposedly draw the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and crush it forever. Yamamoto's piercing eyes reflected both confidence and an unspoken dread. He had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he could promise nothing. Now, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that prophetic timeline hung over the combined fleet like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The plan seemed flawless on paper. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo would lead the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, with 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These floating fortresses had terrorized the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, their veteran pilots earning the grudging respect of enemies who called them the finest naval aviators in the world. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself would follow with the main battleship force, ready to annihilate whatever remained of the American fleet after Nagumo's airstrikes pulverized Midway's defenses. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, possessed something Yamamoto could never have imagined: the ability to read Japanese minds. Thanks to cryptanalysts at Station Hypo who had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25, Nimitz knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. The Americans had turned Yamamoto's surprise attack into an elaborate trap. As referenced in Walter Lord's comprehensive account, Incredible Victory, the Japanese planning suffered from fatal overconfidence and rigid adherence to complex operational schedules that left no room for adaptation when reality intruded upon theory. On the flight decks of Nagumo's carriers, mechanics made final preparations to aircraft that would soon carry Japan's hopes into battle. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, lay in the sickbay of Akagi, suffering from appendicitis. His absence would prove more significant than anyone realized. Fuchida's tactical brilliance and cool judgment under fire were irreplaceable commodities the Japanese could ill afford to lose. Nagumo himself embodied the contradictions that would doom the operation. A cautious, methodical officer thrust into a role demanding lightning-quick decisions and aggressive risk-taking, he commanded the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled while harboring deep reservations about carrier warfare. His expertise lay with battleships and traditional surface combat, not the three-dimensional chess game of naval aviation that Midway would demand. The fog of war was already descending before the first shots were fired. Japanese intelligence had catastrophically underestimated American strength at Midway, believing the garrison held only minimal forces when in reality it bristled with aircraft, marines, and determination. More critically, they assumed the American carriers were either still at Pearl Harbor or operating near the Solomon Islands, a miscalculation that would prove fatal. As dawn approached on June 4th, the die was cast. Yamamoto's grand strategy was about to collide with American preparation, Japanese overconfidence about to meet Yankee innovation, and the rising sun would set on Japan's naval supremacy in the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the flight decks of Nagumo's carriers erupted into controlled chaos as the first wave prepared to launch against Midway. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima Kate, torpedo bombers loaded with high-explosive bombs, 36 Aichi Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters, roared into the pre-dawn darkness under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga. Nagumo watched the aircraft disappear into the gloom, unaware that his every move was being observed. At 5:34, a Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed the electrifying message. Enemy, carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. The element of surprise, so crucial to Japanese planning, evaporated like morning mist. The admiral faced his first critical decision of the day, and it revealed the fundamental flaw in Japanese operational doctrine. Following rigid protocols, Nagumo had held back 93 aircraft as a reserve striking force, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American ships that might appear. But doctrine also demanded that half his fighters remain as combat air patrol over the fleet. This left him juggling competing priorities with insufficient resources to address them all. At 6:20, Tomonaga's radio crackled through the Akagi's communications center. There is need for a second attack wave. Midway's defenses were stronger than intelligence had indicated, and the airfield remained operational. Simultaneously, the Japanese fleet came under attack from Midway-based aircraft, obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, ancient Devastator, torpedo bombers, and Flying Fortress heavy bombers that attacked from high altitude with minimal effect but maximum disruption to Japanese operations. Nagumo made the first of several decisions that would compound into catastrophe. At 7:15, he ordered the reserve strike force to switch from ship attack armament to land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. On the hangar decks, below, ordnance crews began the time-consuming process of changing weapons loads, creating a dangerous accumulation of bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines across the carrier decks. Then, at 7:28, the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft finally reported what Nagumo most feared. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed more than 20 knots. The message sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. American ships, possibly including carriers, were exactly where they weren't supposed to be. Nagumo's carefully orchestrated plan began to unravel as he faced the nightmare scenario Japanese planners had dismissed as impossible. At 7:45, another message arrived that confirmed Nagumo's worst fears. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. The trap was sprung, but the Japanese had walked into it with their eyes wide shut. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, had been steaming toward this moment since receiving Nimitz's intelligence briefing days earlier. Unlike his Japanese counterpart, Spruance understood that carrier warfare demanded aggressive action and acceptance of calculated risks. While Nagumo hesitated, paralyzed by conflicting priorities and incomplete information, Spruance launched everything he had at maximum range. The Americans faced their own challenges. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, knew his obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers were flying death traps against Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But he also knew that someone had to strike first and strike hard, regardless of the cost. Nagumo, caught between the need to recover his Midway strike force, rearm his reserve aircraft, and defend against incoming American attacks, made decision after decision based on incomplete information and contradictory requirements. The fog of war that Clausewitz had described was descending over the Japanese fleet like a suffocating blanket, and their elite officers were about to discover that tactical brilliance meant nothing when strategic miscalculations had already sealed their fate. By 8:30 in the morning, Vice Admiral Nagumo stood at the center of a tactical hurricane aboard the Akagi, his face a mask of controlled tension as radio reports flooded the bridge with contradictory information. The first American torpedo attacks were beginning, and the sea around his precious carriers frothed with anti-aircraft fire and exploding bombs as his fleet weaved desperately through the chaos. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 approached from the southwest, their obsolete Devastators flying barely 50 feet above the wave tops. Waldron had ignored his assigned approach vector, trusting his instincts over battle plans, and his decision led him straight to the Japanese carriers. But the cost was apocalyptic. 0 fighters fell upon the lumbering torpedo bombers like hawks among sparrows. From the bridge of Akagi, Captain Taijiro Aoki watched in grim fascination as American aircraft disintegrated under Japanese fire. One by one, Waldron's 15 Devastators were shot down, their crews disappearing into the Pacific with barely a trace. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a life raft and watching the battle unfold from water level as history pivoted around him. But Waldron's sacrifice and that of his men served a purpose beyond their immediate tactical failure. The torpedo attacks forced Nagumo's carriers to maneuver radically, disrupting their tight formation and drawing the combat air patrol down to sea level, where the Zeros could massacre the slow American torpedo planes. Nagumo faced an impossible Equation. His Midway strike force was returning, low on fuel and ammunition, demanding immediate recovery. The reserve strike force remained on deck, half-armed with land attack bombs when ship-killing torpedoes were desperately needed. American carrier aircraft were approaching from multiple vectors, and his own pilots were scattered across the sky, some pursuing torpedo bombers, while others maintained defensive patrols. At 9:18, the admiral made what seemed like a rational decision under pressure: recover the Midway strike force immediately, then sort out the weapon loadings afterward. But this choice would prove fatal, as it concentrated all four carriers in tight formation, their decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Captain Mark Mitcher's Hornet Air Group had missed the Japanese fleet entirely, flying north while the carriers steamed south. But Enterprise and Yorktown had better navigation, and their dive bombers were climbing to attack altitude even as the Japanese fighters remained at sea level, having just finished slaughtering the torpedo squadrons. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at flank speed, the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the main force after depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake like a highway pointing directly to Nagumo's carriers. At 10:22, McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks just as Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown bombers approached from a different angle. The two attacks were uncoordinated, but their timing was perfect. Nagumo's fighters were out of position. His anti-aircraft guns were focused on the wrong sectors, and his carriers were at their most vulnerable moment. The fog of war that had tormented Nagumo suddenly lifted for the Americans. From 14,000 feet, McCluskey could see all four Japanese carriers spread below him like models on a table. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were recovering aircraft, their flight decks packed, with planes, fuel, and ordnance. Only Hiryu, several miles to the north, remained free to maneuver. As detailed in Gordon Prang's authoritative account, Miracle at Midway, the next 6 minutes would determine the outcome of the Pacific War and demonstrate how quickly naval supremacy could shift from one side to another. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the Enterprise bombers, selected Akagi as his target. The flagship that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack was about to become the first victim of American revenge. As Best's dauntless dive bombers screamed down through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire, Nagumo finally understood that his elite officers had led the Imperial Navy into a trap from which there might be no escape. Lieutenant Dick Best's dauntless dive bomber plunged through the morning sky at 10:26, its engine screaming as anti-aircraft shells burst around the aircraft like deadly fireworks. From his perch in the rear seat, aviation radio man First Class James Murray watched tracer bullets streak past, while Best held the dive bomber steady on its attack run toward the carrier Akagi. Aboard the flagship, Admiral Nagumo stood frozen, as he watched American dive bombers materialize out of the sun like avenging angels. The combat air patrol that should have intercepted them was still climbing back to altitude after massacring the torpedo squadrons. His anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons skyward, but the angles were wrong, the timing catastrophic. Best released his 1,000-pound bomb at 2,000 feet, pulling out of his dive so violently that both men nearly lost consciousness from the G-forces. The bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the amidships elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance cooked off in a hellish inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's other dive bombers were transforming the carrier Kaga into a floating crematorium. Bomb after bomb crashed through the flight deck, each explosion adding to an expanding catastrophe that consumed aircraft, fuel, and men with equal voracity. Within minutes, Kaga's flight deck was a sea of flames, her hangar spaces filled with smoke and destruction. To the south, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers fell upon the carrier Soryu with surgical precision. Despite a malfunction that had jettisoned Leslie's own bomb during the approach, his pilots struck their target with devastating accuracy. 3 bombs hit Soryu in rapid succession, turning Japan's newest fleet carrier into a blazing wreck. The fog of war that had confused and constrained Japanese decision-making suddenly lifted, but the clarity came too late. In 6 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:28, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were reduced to burning hulks. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite mobile striking force, was dying in the Pacific swells under a merciless sun. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, found his flagship transformed from the pride of the combined fleet into a death trap. Fires raged below decks while secondary explosions shook the vessel from stem to stern. The bridge filled with smoke as damage control parties fought desperately to contain blazes that fed on aviation gasoline and high-octane fuel. Nagumo, his face blackened by smoke and his uniform singed, finally grasped the magnitude of the disaster. The careful planning, the meticulous coordination, the supreme confidence of Japan's naval elite, all had crumbled in the face of American determination and superior intelligence. His carriers were burning, his aircraft were destroyed, and his pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had terrorized the Pacific, were trapped aboard doomed ships or floating dead in life preservers. But one carrier remained. Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, had been operating several miles north of the main force when the American dive bombers struck. Yamaguchi, recognizing that the battle's outcome now hung by a thread, immediately launched a counterattack with every aircraft he could muster. At 11:30, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters found the American carrier, Yorktown. The attack was pressed home with typical Japanese ferocity, and 3 bombs struck the American carrier, damaging her flight deck and starting fires in the hangar spaces. For a moment, it seemed Yamaguchi might salvage something from the disaster. But the Americans possessed advantages beyond superior intelligence. Their damage control procedures, perfected through hard experience, proved superior to Japanese methods. Within an hour, Yorktown was back in operation, her flight deck repaired and aircraft launching for another strike against Hiryu. As smoke continued to pour from his burning flagship, Nagumo faced the hardest decision of his career. Admiral Yamamoto, still approaching with the main battle fleet, was demanding information about the tactical situation. How could Nagumo explain that Japan's most elite naval officers had stumbled into an ambush that cost them 3 irreplaceable fleet carriers and hundreds of veteran pilots? The sun that had risen on Japanese confidence was setting on their naval supremacy, and the fog of war was finally lifting to reveal the true cost of miscalculation, overconfidence, and rigid adherence to plans that bore no resemblance to battlefield reality. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific on June 4th, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, watching his pilots prepare for what both he and they knew might be their final mission. The elite officers who had planned Operation MI with such meticulous care were now confronting the brutal reality that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. Yamaguchi embodied the warrior spirit that had driven Japan's early victories, aggressive, innovative, and willing to accept enormous risks for the chance of decisive victory. Unlike the cautious Nagumo, Yamaguchi understood that carrier warfare demanded split-second decisions and the courage to stake everything on a single throw of the dice. As fires continued to rage aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, he launched his remaining aircraft in a desperate attempt to cripple the American carriers before they could finish the destruction of the Kido Butai. At 2:45, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American task force. These were not the green replacements that would plague Japanese aviation later in the war. These were veteran pilots who had honed their skills from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, men whose expertise represented years of intensive training that Japan could never replace. The Americans were ready. Radar had given them advance warning, and fighters from Enterprise and Hornet climbed to intercept the incoming strike. The sky above Task Force 16 erupted into a swirling dogfight as Wildcats tangled with Zeros while the torpedo bombers pressed their attack through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire. Yorktown, still smoking from the morning's bomb hits, but operational thanks to superior American damage control, became the focus of the Japanese attack. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and bringing her to a dead stop. This time the damage seemed fatal. Yorktown listed heavily to port, her power gone, her crew preparing to abandon ship, but Yamaguchi's victory was Pyrrhic. Of the 16 aircraft he had launched, only 5 returned to Hiryu. Japan's pool of Elite pilots, already stretched thin by 6 months of continuous operations, was being consumed at an unsustainable rate. Each loss represented not just an aircraft, but years of training and combat experience that could never be recovered. At 4:30, the inevitable occurred. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the same pilot who had led the morning's devastating attack on the Japanese carriers, appeared over Hiryu with 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. Yamaguchi's last carrier was about to join her sisters in destruction. The attack was surgical in its precision. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck and hangar spaces, starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Within minutes, Japan's last operational carrier was ablaze from bow to stern, her aircraft destroyed, her crew fighting desperately to contain damage that was already beyond control. Yamaguchi faced the same impossible situation that had confronted his colleagues earlier in the day. His ship was doomed, his aircraft were gone, and his mission, the destruction of American naval power in the Pacific, lay in ruins around him. Unlike Nagumo, who had transferred his flag to a cruiser when Akagi became uninhabitable, Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard Hiryu and share the fate of his men. Admiral Yamamoto, still approaching with the main battle fleet in the super battleship Yamato, received the devastating reports with growing disbelief. The 4 carriers that had been the backbone of Japanese naval aviation were burning wrecks. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots were dead or missing. The American fleet, far from being destroyed, was still operational and seeking further combat. As detailed extensively in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Two-Ocean War. The Japanese command structure, that had seemed so efficient and professional during their string of early victories, now revealed fundamental flaws that had been masked by success against unprepared enemies. Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished career. His battleships still outnumbered and outgunned anything the Americans could deploy. But without air cover, they would be sitting ducks for American carrier aircraft. The element of surprise was gone. The enemy was alerted and aggressive, and continuing the operation would likely result in an even greater disaster. At 9:30 that evening, Yamamoto issued the order that effectively ended Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. Occupation of Midway is canceled. The combined fleet, which had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide for 6 months, was retreating in defeat, leaving behind the burning hulks of 4 fleet carriers and the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy. As night fell on June 4, 1942, the fog of war was finally lifting to reveal the true cost of the elite officer's failure at Midway. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of Yamato, staring into the blackness, where his dreams of decisive victory had dissolved into nightmare. The architect of Pearl Harbor faced the wreckage of his most ambitious operation, surrounded by staff officers who dared not meet his eyes as damage reports continued to arrive. From the burning carriers they were leaving behind, the evacuation of the surviving carrier crews had been a study in both heroism and horror. Aboard Akagi, Captain Taijiro Aoki had refused to abandon ship until the last possible moment, directing firefighting efforts even as explosions rocked his vessel. When the order finally came to evacuate, many of the flagship's crew were already dead, victims of the fires and secondary explosions that had consumed their ship from within. Vice Admiral Nagumo, rescued from the blazing Akagi by destroyer, sat in stunned silence as he contemplated the magnitude of his failure. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now presided over the worst defeat in the history of the Imperial Navy. His rigid adherence to doctrine, his inability to adapt when plans collided with reality, and his fatal hesitation at critical moments had cost Japan its naval supremacy and any hope of achieving decisive victory in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi had chosen a different path. When Hiryu became uninhabitable, he remained aboard with Captain Tomeo Kaku, both men electing to go down with their ship rather than face the shame of survival. Their bodies were never recovered, but their sacrifice epitomized the warrior code that had driven Japan's early victories and now demanded payment for failure. The human cost extended far beyond the admirals and captains. Chief Petty Officer Juzo Mori, one of Japan's most experienced dive bomber pilots, had perished when Soryu exploded. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, The Zero fighter ace who had led the Pearl Harbor airstrikes was among the missing. These were not replaceable losses. Each man represented years of training and combat experience that Japan's truncated pilot training programs could never duplicate. American search and rescue operations continued throughout the day, plucking Japanese survivors from life rafts and debris fields. Many of these men, including Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had been evacuated from Akagi's sickbay, would spend the remainder of the war in prisoner camps, their expertise lost to Japan's increasingly desperate naval situation. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1/3 of their total carrier strength, along with most of their veteran pilots and aircraft. The mobile striking force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was gone, replaced by a collection of damaged cruisers and destroyers fleeing toward home waters. More critically, Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific War, never to regain it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, understood immediately that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. The intelligence breakthrough that had made the victory possible, combined with superior American industrial capacity and improved combat techniques, had shifted the balance of power decisively toward the United States. Yamamoto, still hoping to salvage something from the disaster, briefly considered engaging the American fleet with his battleships during the night hours when Japanese expertise in night fighting might prove decisive. But his staff officers, finally finding the courage to speak honestly, convinced him that continuing the operation would only multiply the disaster. Without air cover, his battleships would face the same fate as the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse, which Japanese aircraft had sunk off Malaya 6 months earlier. The retreat that followed was as chaotic as the battle itself. Destroyers raced to scuttle the burning carriers before they could fall into American hands, while surviving Japanese forces scattered across the Pacific in search of safety. The tight formations and coordinated movements that had characterized Japanese operations since Pearl Harbor dissolved into confusion and recrimination. As Yamato turned west toward Japan, her massive bulk cutting through swells that reflected the glow of burning carriers, Yamamoto finally grasped the full magnitude of what had occurred. His elite officers, trained in the finest naval academies and seasoned by victory after victory, had failed because they could not adapt when their carefully laid plans encountered the friction and chaos of real combat. The fog of war that had confused Japanese decision-making at Midway would never fully lift. Until the end of the Pacific War, Japanese naval officers would struggle with the same combination of overconfidence, rigid thinking, and inability to process contradictory information that had doomed the Kido Butai. In the end, Japan's elite officers had failed, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they could not accept that their enemies were capable of matching Japanese determination with superior intelligence, better technology, and the crucial advantage of fighting a defensive battle on their own terms. The rising sun had set on Japanese naval supremacy, and it would never rise again.